All right, this week we're going to pick up with vaYiqra, chapter 21, verse 22. Of course, I'll back up to 21, as is my custom. But before I get into that, I started last week talking about somebody who had sent me a note uh, making what I felt like was a negative commentary on me, what I've done, whatever. I don't know. He was talking about this thing over my head. He said something about, I hope that's not a cross over your head. And I explained to him that that's the first and last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the ancient uh, alphabet. The aleph is like an upside down A, and the tav, the aleph is the first letter, the tav is the last. And so in ancient Hebrew writing, they would just put the aleph and the tav maybe together like this, and the aleph was in fact sideways, like it would kind of crooked. It's not supposed to look like an A, upside down or otherwise. That's what the aleph looked like. Sometimes it would be more of a just a V with a line through it. Well, why is that? Because in ancient times, that was a ox yoke, not an ox, an ox yoke. And if you make a V with a line going through it, that's actually what the old, really, really old ox yokes looked like. They were very primitive. And so the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is not an ox. God, who does not allow his people to have 3D images of animals that walk on this planet, did not give us an ox as the first letter of our alphabet. That's nonsense. How did it become that? Well, because little kids put you have it, think of the V with the line going across, and then somebody puts two little eyeballs. Now you have a cow, an ox, whatever you want to call it. That's how that came about, almost without any shadow of a doubt. That's how that came. Somebody just drew eyeballs in it, and then it went from being an ox yoke to an ox. You follow? That's how that happened. So now you have Jews running around telling everybody, teaching classes about how the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is an ox. No, it's not. And the Tate is not a snake, it's a rope. I digress. Anyway, so this is the paleo. And he wrote me back this week. I read what he said three times. I have no idea what he was talking about, or what his point was, if he's going away and never coming back or still list. I don't have any idea. But he did say something that I thought I should talk to you guys about. There's a lot of Jews who are born into Judaism. They grow up going to synagogue. They grow up on the days they're supposed to fast, sneaking food. Everybody knows that's what everybody does, but they all pretend like they're fasting. They grow up, the only time they ever wear tzitzit, which we are commanded by God's law to wear every day on the outer garment, no matter whether we're wearing our favorite outfit or this outfit or our shul outfit or our, Shabbat outfit. There's supposed to be fringe on the outside of our outer garment. That's why it called it the four corners. That was an idiomatic usage of the Hebrew language, meaning that it had to be on the outside of anything you covered up. Also meaning that your blanket that you sleep under or sheet that you sleep under is also supposed to have fringe on it if you wrap it around yourself and walk around with it. Sleeping in bed, that's a gray area. You can do it, you cannot do it. We tried that. We kept getting our feet, our toes caught in it, and it hurt a couple of times, because the way we got caught in it is like, eh. But if I do wrap myself with it, it should probably have fringe on it. So that little throw I wear, we probably ought to put some fringe on that. I just now thought of that. Anyway, it's supposed to be on your outer garment, and they don't do that. They're not even taught that. In fact, there's sages who taught that you didn't have to do it at all. And so some Jews grow up that way. What I'm saying is they basically grow up in Judaism the way Christians grow up in Christian. A lot of Christians grow up in the Christian world. The only time they're Christians is when it's convenient, and the rest of the time they're just regular people. And that's sad. That's really sad. And Christians know less about Christianity and are the worst example of Christianity of anybody. Just like Jews tend to be the worst example of Judaism and know less about Judaism than anybody else. All religions are like that. It's not exclusive to any religion. So, in this message, and I wish I could have understood it, I know it meant something to him, but the way it was written, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. But he said something uh, to the effect, uh, he, he said, I think that he's Jewish and he recently, I guess, stumbled across Christian stuff and then, but he realized that that was all evil and wrong, and he said something negative about the New Testament and all of that. Okay, well, a lot of Jews are like that. Where if you're growing up Judaism, you may not really be too terribly Jewish. You may not. I mean, you may be atheist. That's not very Jewish. Oh, but I was born that way. Well, that's not very Jewish. If all that makes you a Jew is your genealogy, that's not a lot to go on there as far as being Jewish, especially since the Hebrew word Yehudi means imitator of Yahweh. God called him by name using that word. So what the Yod does is call out God by name, who being imitator, impersonator. Well, so to me, there's a lot more to Judaism than just the bloodline. Okay. So anyway, so there's a lot of Jews who do that. It's not really all that deep. And they begin to read parts of the Hebrew Bible that they're told not to read. Can you imagine that? God gives us a book and says, "Oh, but by the way, here's some parts of that book you're not allowed to read. It's forbidden." They just go along with it. I say they because I didn't. I read it, right? And so a lot of Jews do that. Well, once you've read that, and then you read the New Testament letters, it's like, wait, these kind of say the same exact thing. The books that we're not allowed to read talk about a Messiah coming. They say he's going to be brutally murdered. They say he's going to raise from the dead. They say he's going to be born of a virgin and everything. Says he's going to ride into town on a donkey. I mean, then you start reading the New Testament. It's like, wait, kind of seems like it happened, and maybe that's why the Jewish sages and rabbis, rabbin, tell us not to read that stuff. So what do? Okay, you give up Judaism and go believe in Jesus and start becoming a Christian. No, no, there is nothing more wrong than that. That you have just gone from, I'm going to say it, not being a good Jew, not being an observant, obedient Jew like you're supposed to be, like our forefathers promised we would be, to being an idol worshiper, a follower of false teaching. Is the New Testament all that? No, it's what was done to the New Testament that's all that. Is the New Testament Christian? No, it's not. The translation of the Greek letters that were a translation of Hebrew letters that were actually written by legitimate Jewish rabbin concerning matters of the Jewish religion had nothing to do with Christianity. Those letters got perverted. And from that perversion, you get this idol worshiping, paganized, basically God hating, our God hating infidels, imbeciles. That's the word I meant to say. Hey, either one. That's how I feel about it. I've read the Greek text. I've translated that Greek text into Hebrew and English. And by the way, it's completely Jewish. It's completely based on the Torah. There is nothing in there that says you can eat pork. There is nothing in there that says that you don't have to obey God because you live by this thing called grace. That's not in there. That's in the translation. That's in the perversion, but that's not what the Rabbim wrote. What they wrote was that everybody had to live according to God's law. The whole New Testament, that's all it's about is obeying God's law. If it's translated the way it should have been translated through the eyes of a Jewish rabbi, only way it can be understood. So you've got to be skeptical of all of these Christianized versions of this translation, even if they're messianic, because that's the problem that I have with the messianic Jews, is that they're not messianic and they're not Jewish. They're Christians dressing up like Jews, pretending to be Jews. Maybe they are by bloodline, but you're not living like a Jew. You're not obeying God anymore. You're living by grace. You're believing in three gods who are in total agreement, so that therefore makes them one God. Holy smokes, what is that? The New Testament doesn't actually say that in Greek. That's from the perversion. That's not from the text. But once you've been raised up believing in that whole Trinity nonsense, and you don't know your Judaism at all, and you don't know Hebrew at all, then you go and you read it and like, see there, that's Trinitarian. No, it's not. So what I'm saying is that I am a Jewish rabbi. I am not Messianic. I am not Christian. But I don't have any problem with the New Testament at all as per the way I've translated it. I'm sure there's probably, 500 people out there who have done the same thing I've done. I just don't know who they are. If you've done it, call me up. I'd like to talk to you. But you better be able to talk to me in Hebrew or Greek, a little of both maybe, or I'm not going to believe you're for real. Anyway, if you're Jewish and you've come to realize that God did everything he said he was going to do, that Moshe was not a false prophet, that Daniel was not a false prophet, that Yirmiyahu or Jeremiah was not a false prophet, because if you are rejecting that Yeshua, not Jesus, but Yeshua was in fact God manifest in human flesh, then you got a problem, a big one. Because if that's your stance, then you're saying that all of the prophets were false, particularly Daniel and Yirmiyahu. They have to have been false prophets if Yeshua was not a manifestation of God in human flesh, not God having a baby with some woman in human flesh, but God being the baby coming to this earth in human flesh. God, not his child, but God was the child. If you don't get that, then you have a problem with all of your prophets being false. If, on the other hand, you get that Yeshua fulfilled everything that the prophet said and was therefore God in human flesh, and now you're following after Christianity, you're just as lost as you were when you started. Jews don't do that. The whole New Testament's all about following God's law. It's about not following man's law over God's law. So if man says the most important thing is that you preserve life, so you got to break Torah to save life, don't listen to that. Don't listen to that. That shows a complete and utter lack of trust in God. If you're so important that your life has to be saved, God will save it. And for the most part, you're not going to be that important. Not even me. I'm not even that important. So anyway, let's get on with the lesson. Don't do that, Jews. You stick with Judaism. And you be okay with the fact that God came, he reinstated our covenant, and the whole point in reinstating our covenant was so that we could live by it. That was the whole point. So the end of the age was not the end of the world as we know it, like Christians had turned it into. It was the end of the age where we Jews had no covenant with God. That ended. Our covenant has been reinstated. That means we're just supposed to go back and live the way Moshe lived after the law was given, right? That's what the whole thing was about. That's why Yeshua got in the flesh, rode into town on a donkey, and everybody started yelling Hoshana. And on and on. I don't remember what they said, but you know, oh, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord or in the power of the Lord. Name Shem meant something completely different back then than it does now. Wasn't just a person's name. Are we ready to? Okay, I don't know if she's doing the blinky thing or not. All right, so let's get going with the message. Verse 21 is from last week. This is my translation. Every man who has a defect in him, and last week we laid out what the defects were, from the seed of Aharon, so that's the Kohanim and the Kohen Hagadol. That's the seed of Aharon. We established that earlier in the chapter. So everyone of those guys will not come near to the fire offering of Yahweh with a defect in them. You won't do that. So if your defect, one of them was to have some sort of a blemish, you got some kind of open wound, you cut yourself while you were trying to add on a room to your bedroom or whatever, you can't go making sacrifices while that wound is open. Once it closes up, now you can, because the blemish is not the scar that's left. The blemish was the open wound, right? So once that closes back up, you can go back to making sacrifices. But while you have this defect, as we're only English word I could think of to use that would make at least some semblance of sense compared to the Hebrew word, if you had that, you couldn't make sacrifices. And some of those blemishes were forever. You couldn't change that. You lose an eye and an accident of some sort, or in war or whatever, well, you're not going to grow an eye back, and you won't ever be able to make the sacrifices again. That doesn't mean you can't be a Cohen and you can't do the duties of the Cohen, but that's the one duty that you cannot do. You can't. This is one of the most holy things that any one of God's children does, is make the sacrifices that help God's children uh, get back in right standing with God. That's part of living according to the law, is getting back in right standing with God when you've messed up. So this is one of the most holy things, and God wants his Kohanim, while they're doing this, to be as pure as is humanly possible. Anyway, so it's every man who has a defect in him from the seed or the children of Aharon, the Cohen, the Kohanim, will not come near to the fire offering of Yahweh with a defect in him. He will not come near, and it says literally, the bread of his God. Our God does not eat human food. He does not eat bread. It's an idiom for the sacrifices. He will not draw near the fire. It literally says fire, but we generally connect that with fire offering. But we could have just said fire. He will not draw near the fire of Yahweh with the defect in him. He will not come near the sacrifices. That's what it said. So now in verse 22, it says, very literally in English, this is very, very literal, bread God his holy things, the holies, and from the holies he eat. And I wanted to wait and pick back up on that this week because of holy and holies. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And so it begins with lechem. Will you go to the computer and let them see that? Let me get rid of this little wacky-do here. Yeah. Look at what I wrote while I divert your attention from what I'm doing. so I think I made it worse. Okay. Now, yes, it's bread. It's food for men and for animals. Wheat of the flour. The Hebrews made their bread. Very literal. But in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, it's what we call a primitive language. It does not mean that these people were primitive and uneducated and dumb and Neanderthalistic, and running around hitting their women with a big stick. No, it just means it. Primitive language is a different type of language. We don't have a primitive language in English. It's not primitive. Primitive language, they use a lot less words, and each individual word will have a lot more meaning. Where in our world, we have one word for everything. And so you have to tie all these words together to get a meaning. Well, that's not necessary in a primitive language. And so while we talk about the word lechem, and it literally is the word for bread, it's also the word for communion. And we have something, we used to say this a lot, let's break bread together. You weren't really going to break bread together, were you? You're going to get together and have the fried chicken and mashed potatoes. And, if you're a Christian, if you're Jewish, you're having gefilte fish. And I have never tried that. It is the nastiest looking, smelling, feeling thing. I ain't going to touch it. Anyway, you know what I'm saying? So you're getting together, you're using the word bread, and it has a connection to food, but it's more about let's get together and, well, in this case, have food. But in the Christian world, it was let's get together and have fellowship. So, anyways, the bread Elohiv, and that's from El, which is the word for mighty hero. It gets translated as God with a little g, mostly when they're talking about the God who created everything and is the God of the Jews. They generally make a capital G. None of that means anything biblically or religiously, whether it's capital or not capital, has nothing to do with it. Our El is our Av, Avinu, our God is El. God, that's an English word. It means nothing in Hebrew. It has nothing to do with the Bible, especially when you talk about false images and false idols. They use the word El, Elohim in plural. It's just a generic word, and it doesn't actually mean God. It means mighty hero. Well, who's the most mighty of all heroes? Well, that's going to be the God and creator of all that is. That's as high up as you get, and that's why he gets a capital letter in English. But we have no capital letters in Hebrew. No, we don't. We don't. There's no such thing. Anyway, so it's the bread of God. And again, we already kind of established that's the sacrifices. It's being used idiomatic because it's a primitive language. And so we're going to use as few words as we possibly can to get an idea across. Now it says mi kadshe. And that's how they would have pronounced it back in the day. I don't know if they pronounce it that way today. I kind of think they don't. But mi kashe. And so what's that? Well, it's literally from holies. The mem as the of or from to a Hebrew word, and that's been added on to the front of this. I'm going to have to rush. I'm starting to have a lot of trouble here. But this is holy in plural. It's what is holy, what is concentrated to God. For something to be holy, it has to be set aside for a specific purpose. And in this case, it would be a specific purpose in the work of God. I've said it before. This clothing that I wear on Shabbat, the only time I ever wear it is on a Shabbat. So yes, I do wear it during the festivals because they open with what? A Shabbat. I, I, I can't I can't not do this. Oh, go. Dang it. Go to my translation. I need a minute. I didn't think about the fact that I wouldn't be able to talk while I was doing that. Okay. I'm just going to skip the meanings and just get right to what I want to say about this. Translation says, "From the holy he will eat." And of course, I have the sacrifices because it says the bread of his God. So that's from the holy he will eat sacrifices. From the holy, and then I added that, and the most holy. Okay, there's a couple of things here we want to really notice about this verse. First, we just picked up on last week, it said that if a Cohen, not just anybody, but if a Cohen, whether he's Haggadah, whether he's the high priest, or he's just a regular Cohen, because you're one or the other, and there's only one high priest at a time, although it's like president, after you've stopped being the high priest and retired and somebody else is the high priest, they're still going to call you the high priest, right? The Kohen Haggadah. But so this is for specifically for the priest. This is if he has a blemish, and we named those off last week. While he has this blemish, he cannot make these sacrifices. He can't even go near the fire for the sacrifice. So he can't carry wood to help stoke. He can't stoke the fire. He's not allowed anywhere near the sacrifice. That's the point. But then the next verse says, "From the holy he will eat." So he hasn't become any less holy. He hasn't become any less a Cohen. There's nothing less about this person. He has not become a second class citizen. And God made it real clear he still gets to eat from those sacrifices. Because a lot of people, and I've said this before, if we would just use the word barbecue instead of sacrifice, there'd be a lot less resistance to the idea of making sacrifices among the non-Jewish world, maybe even among the Jewish world. Because you think of sacrifices and you connect that to the pagan world, and they're just killing animals for the sake of killing animals and just burning them. And, no, our sacrifices ended in people eating food. It was a barbecue. It's what we think of as a barbecue in our world. Part of it went to the Cohen, and part of it went to the person who brought the sacrifice. None of it, well, I shouldn't say none of it was wasted, but they would, the parts that people ought not be eating because probably because it carries disease and stuff like that. God wasn't real specific about it, but we do know that intestines and stuff like that are designed to carry bad stuff out of the body. So we don't eat those parts. And that, yes, that part is fried, burn up, whatever. Even Ezra correctly wrote that while a blemished Cohen was not allowed to make sacrifices, he was allowed to eat from them. You're like, well, duh, he just said the obvious. Yeah, but if he had to bring that up in his time, it it's obvious that there was some confusion about it among the people that he encountered. Mm. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to call it. We'll just do this next week. Shalom, shalom.